Welcome to the Today's Leader podcast. Building tomorrow's best leaders, today.
Way to go, guys. Way to go. Keep it going. Good job, guys. All right, Paul, I see you. All right, John, let's finish. Sean, Coach Carl, let's go. Great job, guys.
Hey there, it's Coach Corrie here, and welcome to this very special episode of the Today's Leader podcast, Building Tomorrow's Best Leaders Today. I recently hosted a panel discussion where we attempted to answer the question, do healthy leaders build healthy culture? Now, the panel featured three amazing global experts, and their insights were amazing. First up, we had Erin Jewel-Gerst from Erin Jewell Coaching from Pennsylvania in the United States. We had Belinda Jayne Dolan, the CEO of Quantum Wellness, who joined us from Lapland in Finland. And we had Corrie, Good Human Inclusion Strategies and local legend right here in Brisbane. Now, the reason for the panel discussion is due in many ways to the current uncertainty and pressures being felt by organisations and leaders with the continuing health crisis and pandemic front and centre. Now, due to this, we are seeing shifts in the workplace. We are seeing resignation shifts. They're calling it the Great Resignation. We're seeing a general reluctance for people to return to the office full time. And all of this uncertainty is being felt by leaders right around the world. Now, we've changed the editing from this episode as my guests were exceptional, so we decided to remove the host, which was me, from the actual conversation. We've dissected the conversation and interspersed it with some of my commentary around what was actually said and what I took away from the conversation. This way, the focus is very clearly on the insights from the experts. This was our very first panel discussion for the podcast, and there is just so much gold from our experts. So the first question that I asked to get the conversation going, is it a fair assumption that culture is driven by leadership? Is it a fair assumption that culture is driven by leadership? Now, Erin grabbed the question first and drove with a perspective based around her academic experience, and she was quickly followed by Cindy and Belinda to add their thoughts.
Absolutely, and first of all, I just want to say thanks for having me today, and I feel honored to be alongside Cindy and Belinda, and nice work, Coach Carl, bringing us all together. So, it's such a great question, and absolutely, because, from my perspective and what we talk about when we talk about leadership and some of the courses I teach over at Villanova, we talk about culture not being static. We talk about culture being something that can and does evolve over time and is influenced by many factors. We're talking about competing perspectives, different life experiences, and even goals that individuals, that leaders have. So from that perspective, yes, absolutely, culture can be impacted and affected by leadership.
I would say that, yes, it's driven by leadership, or it's maybe the responsibility of leadership to drive. But I would also say that everybody owns it, and everybody has a role to play in the way that they shape, influence, and create that evolution in culture that happens in organisations over time. I think everybody has a part to play, and it is all about our relationships and the way that we treat each other, the way that we work together. And as much as we rely on our leaders to be at the helm and sort of drive those things sometimes, it's great to see organisations where everybody feels responsible for the way that it feels in the workplace, and they support the leaders to do that.
Yeah, I absolutely echo both Erin and Cindy's comments. I'd also I'd also go to the level where, yes, whilst it is primarily a function of leadership to drive, for example, cultural change, cultural nuances, but why are we not looking at co-creation? You know, that we've put this focus on leaders, but leaders in terms of that delegated or distributed leadership model, why can't we co-create? You know, we've built, one of the things that we're currently doing at the moment is building organisations that co-create these environments. So it's not just the focus on that 1, 2, 3, however many leaders there are in the organisation. So primarily the answer is yes to the question. But I would also say, given what we've been going through now over the last 2 years, I think there is an evolution happening, and I think it's a positive evolution, and I think it's a co-creation revolution where it's not just about leaders anymore, it's about all of us taking ownership and co-creating an environment that creates well-being and trust within organisations across the globe.
So there was a bit of an overriding belief that for culture to be effective, the idea is that it's firmly driven from right throughout the company. And that came clearly out within that conversation. Yes, there is an old saying that culture is driven from the chair, and that is still correct, but ownership for developing a good culture sits with everyone within the organisation. But for a culture to be truly effective, a leader must have strength, trust, and allow a level of vulnerability for a good culture to be formed. And those three things come out continually in the conversations coming forward. Now, one of the great things within this panel discussion was for the different viewpoints from our experts. And what this allows is for a range of ideas to be expressed and insights gathered. And this will be a benefit for you to decide which is the best way forward for you. Now, this became clearly evident for me as the host when I asked the definition for a healthy leader. This time, Cindy kicked us off.
That is such a hard question because I think healthy is really subjective. I think people have different ways to be healthy, and people have different perspectives and experiences on what health actually means in their lives and how they can be a healthy leader. So I think that's really difficult. I think that there might be good practices that people can use and can sort of rely on in their leadership. You know, we talk about things like good communication. We talk about things like openness and honesty and all of those things, and they're great ways of being a healthy leader, I suppose. If we're talking about mental health, I think that's hugely subjective. I think that there are lots and lots of realms within mental health, and I think that it's very much about person's experiences and what will work for them. I don't know that we can really kind of go, a healthy leader, isn't depressed or doesn't have a chronic illness, or I think that would be pretty unfair to say those things, to be honest.
Well, Coach Curl, you know that I always challenge assumptions, don't you? You and I have often had healthy debate around this. So I'm actually going to challenge the assumption of the notion of a healthy leader. So, if we go back to the World Health Organization's definition as a state of health being like a state of physical and mental, social well-being, we talk about the absence of disease. So why are we placing such a clinical term and attaching it to a leadership? Why are we operating in this paradigm of health and leadership together? I would challenge, and this is why I always love speaking to yourself and having these conversations, and I'm so blessed to be here with Erin and Cindy as well today. Why can't we look at it as well-being? Why can't we look at it as being that life satisfaction and how comfortable we are in our present situation as leaders? So we put a wellness or a well-being framework, as opposed to not necessarily attaching it in, a medical paradigm, in the sense of, putting a health perspective on it. So, and then we can look at environmental factors and defining sleep and all of these other attributes that come along with leadership as well. So, yeah, just challenging that one, Coach Curl.
So I'm really enjoying the comments that are being made, and Tony, Coach Curl, this is my world that I play in, and so prior to becoming a coach, my focus was building online wellness platforms that focused on the mind, body, and spirit, health, well-being, wellness. So it's a systems approach. From my perspective, and my experience has been it's a systems approach. So what came to mind specifically when you said the term healthy leaders, I thought of the assessment, the Enneagram. So it's an assessment that as coaches we use assessments. It gives us an opportunity to work off of something with coaching clients. So the Enneagram assessment, if you're not familiar with it, it assigns these numbers and these names. So for example, my Enneagram, I'm 237, which is helper, enthusiast, and achiever. And it goes on to talk about, and a lot of assessments have this overlap, but it goes on to talk about what happens when I'm in that healthy state, right? So when I'm in that healthy state, for example, as a helper, I tend to show up in very selfless ways. I tend to feel like I have a lot of resources to share and to offer and to give when I'm in that healthy state. So as my colleagues Cindy and Belinda have both mentioned, it's a broad term, it's a subjective term, it's a personal term. Recognizing, however, that there does exist that healthy state for the individual. Now, health could be associated with a lot of different things. Like I said, I feel like it's a systems approach. I personally, the things I do for my health and well-being are probably quite different from perhaps any of you on this panel this morning. The things that I do to allow myself to express my gifts in a healthy manner require me to actually focus on things like my physical health, my mental health, my emotional health, my spiritual health, right? So I do believe when you ask what is a healthy leader, I think there's a self-awareness, there's a self-observation involved, and there's also a desire to show up a certain way.
Well, as you can see, one size does not fit all. Now, being healthy is different to everyone, depending on where you are and what stage of life and what you're currently going through. As Belinda pointed out, the clinical expression of health may not be the best fit when it comes to the description or describing leaders. And when Erin spoke to wellness, well, it covered much of what had been shared by the three experts, covering the openness, the mindfulness and stability that were some of the similarities of concept that was shared. I also really liked Erin's approach to a healthy state. And that was one that I think everyone can take on board and work with. And that comes from a self-awareness, a self-care and a desire to make sure that you're doing the right thing. I think one of the compelling things that I've seen with leaders at the moment is that there is an overstimulus on things that are fundamentally outside of their control. A leader has a sense of control, and some leaders have a sense that they're losing that control. But they're also facing a loss of connection with their team, and with this over-reliance of external factors, this often spirals leaders into a toxic space. Can a leader transcending into that toxic and negative space support a positive culture? Let's see what the experts think.
So the first thing that comes to mind when you say that is I think about, and this is already, the energy of this is already kind of coming through some of the responses, at least in my assessment. A leader is only as effective as their followers. The effectiveness, the efficacy of a leader is based on the happiness of the followers, so to speak, right? So, that all being said, I personally have been part of organizations where, I say leadership runs through an organization like electricity through wires. So if you have an entire culture that wishes for something to be different in an organization, and I'm talking the majority of the humans, I do believe that that can be listened to. There's an example that comes to mind. British Airways actually was known as being a balcony. There's a term for it. It's like balcony management company, where they kind of like looked down at their employees and customers once upon a time, and that really came back to bite them. And to the extent that it affected their revenue, because it wasn't only affecting the employees, but it was also affecting the customers. It was like toxic. So that shifted. So there was almost like that push from the bottom. However, I do think, and I've been in these situations myself, where, for example, if you have leaders that think self-care is a luxury, or think well-being's like a nice to have, but we don't really make time for that here because we're here to make money, kind of, like that is going to permeate the organization. So perhaps I would say it depends on what you're talking about, because I think there are certain things that people are kind of afraid to step into initially. And so if their leaders aren't doing it, they're going to be less likely to make that change themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, to shift the onus on one person, as opposed to an organization is made up of the greatness within. And if we move away from the deficit model and we move purely to a strengths-based model, which from a leadership and coaching perspective, we know there's a plethora of research around this subject. So shifting from that deficit model of looking at, well, it's only one person that drives the culture, top down, bottom up, across. Why don't we view it as a multifaceted approach, so that we do have, yes, of course, having toxic leadership or having toxic individual behaviours, values, and misalignments with organisational beliefs and values will absolutely impede an organisation. But I've also worked in environments both as an advisor, a consultant, and obviously as a CEO. And I've also seen that there has been ways in which we can actually shift. We can actually shift the behaviours, even if you have a number of people who are misaligned with an organisation, and that could potentially be the leadership. So, I think there is, and it goes back, well, what we'll talk about later around, the healthy culture. But I think we need to shift the focus off it being one or two, and I think it's organisationally across the board, including board as well. Actually, we've talked about leadership, but we haven't really touched upon that on the board as well. And having just come off a board meeting, I think it's important that it's leadership, it's the board, and obviously it's our team members, our organisational people that run the organisation alongside leaders.
I completely agree. And I do think it is, as Belinda said, it is multifaceted, and I've seen that firsthand, both in organisations that I've led and organisations that I've done work with. I think that it is this kind of mixture of personalities and qualities that, when you bring them together, create a certain feel. And whether they're in a leadership position or not, it really depends on the way that people work together. And so when people are given a responsibility of leadership on top of a certain set of qualities, we can see that there's going to sometimes be a natural misalignment. And so it is really about everybody else aligning themselves to a vision, and it not being about the leader, but it being about the vision. And when people are doing that, when there's misalignment, it's not as impactful, and it can be resolved much more easily. When we're not all hung up on the one person, we're not all there to follow a leader, we're actually there to follow a vision. And, we talked about boards before, and that's really a big part of what a board does. I sit on lots of boards. So it's really the important is about that buy-in and that sense of belonging to a vision that really takes it away from a person being a leader to a commitment to the organisation itself. And that is sometimes the very thing that keep people coming back to work every day. Sometimes that's their saving grace when leadership isn't working. So when that vision is strong, it's communicated well, and people feel like they belong to it, those sorts of issues aren't as impactful and don't impact the business as much.
So shifting behaviours and aligning to the visions. And once again, we've got a lesser focus on the overall leader and broadening this spread of responsibility around culture. You know, the multifaceted view that our experts spoke about. So less reliance on a single leader and more reliance on that responsibility that everyone takes on board. Now, after listening in, it would be fair to say that recruitment of the right people for your organisation is also paramount in this particular struggle. People with the right purpose and the right approach, the right attitude, the right skill set, the right mindset are really, really important for leaders to be able to embrace this overall accountability, responsibility for the culture. Now, committing to the organisation was a key point that Cindy shared, with vision that's strong and communicated well. When that is the case, people will align themselves with the organisation. So to build a good, strong culture, there's some key leadership traits that provide that overarching feel or alignment to the company. And these are very much needed. And these traits need to be exhibited right through the organisation at every level. So taking the focus off the individual leader and applying the broad brush of consistent leadership skills will help arrest the downward spiral of potentially toxic cultures. So that's a really good, strong point that I'm hoping that leaders can take away from that particular discussion. Cindy took on the next challenge when I asked for the definition of what a healthy culture looks like.
I see good communicators. I see people who respect individual uniqueness of the people that come in to work every day, that understand that not everybody is the same and won't have the same view or the same way of working, but that's appreciated and respected, rather than seen as something that creates barriers. I see that commitment to vision. I see egos aside, and I see work being done to progress that vision. And really that's what culture really is all about, is why are we there? And why do we come to work every day? And working together to achieve something is really what a good culture looks like.
So, and as I'm listening here, I'm realizing what a great idea it is to take advantage of the fact that you have 3 panelists calling in from 3 different parts of the world, with living in three different cultures, right? Certainly with some overlap. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we all have a lot more in common than we do different. But from a company perspective and from a company culture perspective, I think that, I'm even thinking about like the fact that the U.S. culture, is hierarchical and capitalistic, and, the culture in the U.S. is individualistic. So it's all about, and these are all generalizations, right? But they're not stereotypes. They are educated. In the United States, we are valued and recognized and acknowledged for our individual achievements. So, the great myth about leadership, it's been kind of like romanticized, but there's also some validity to it, at least in the U.S. culture. And I have worked in the international markets as well. I lived in Spain, so I have some exposure to these other cultures. But I think that's important to take into consideration with, at least with my responses, right? Because they're through a lens. And so that being said, a happy, healthy culture, very similar to what Cindy said, conscious communicators. Here in the U.S., we're really facing some unprecedented times in our culture with regard to DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. We're learning how to talk to each other. We're learning how to advocate through inquiry. We're learning, how to advocate for the things that we believe in thoughtful and intentional ways. We're learning to have conversations about our differences with each other and to talk about our biases, to talk about our implicit, our unconscious biases toward race, toward gender, toward other cultures around the globe. We're learning to talk about our lens, our perspective. So to have this actually exist within an organization, I think, is still a bit progressive. And my hope is that changes. And I'll say too that I think a culture is also it's knowledgeable in its area of expertise. I think that's really important that companies continue to hire people that based on their strengths and talents and that can really contribute to the needs of the organization. And then I think the only other thing I would say is a happy and healthy culture has a sense of humor. We're living in unprecedented times here, and there's so much opportunity for heaviness, and at the end of the day, it's not that serious. It's not, business is business, and the world isn't gonna, and I think cultures forget that. They get so tied to the number, and they get so tied to results, and so it's like keeping it light, right? Having that light heart.
As part of the work that we did through the Chief Happiness Officer, and also the work that we do. I personally have worked across 11 countries, lived and worked in 11 countries now and researched, currently researching in the field. And I find it really interesting that we have, and Erin spoke about the lens in which we view this. So the lens in which we view and how we've categorised it within our Chief Happiness Officer, we've distilled it down into 7 key fundamental principles. I've wrote quite extensively about this within my PhD as well. Now, by saying 7, we're not suggesting that there's 7 ways, and every culture, every positive, happy, engaged culture has all 7 of these. But there's 7 key principles, and that we've distilled down over many years of research and speaking to hundreds of organisations across the world, and I think where we aimed the Chief Happiness Officer was taking the research, taking the operational assumptions, and then obviously working across multiple countries to try and include a framework that could be operated across multiple countries. So, for example, if you're talking about happy, engaged, healthy cultures, you're talking about retention, for example, being high and turnover low. You're talking about generally well-being is received well. So when we talk about well-being, happiness, and even things to do with organisational change, so number 2 would be around it being, well received and engaged. The work is challenging and rewarding. So we set up a framework that worked with leaders and organisations and boards that created challenging and rewarding environments. Creating the 4th will be creating that place for people where organisations actually have a pipeline of people wanting to join their team. They're actually attracting top talent as opposed to, having to actively exit people, because of cultural implications. They're actually attracting them and have a fantastic pipeline. Shared leadership, which we've spoke about before as well. Also as well around toxicity. There's a little tolerance for toxicity, for workplace politics, for example, and that's where some of the organisations that we've worked with, from Virgin, from the Australian government, whether that's state, federal government, that's what we found, where the organisations have got low tolerance for workplace politics, for example, and then engagement, and there's another few values and fundamental key principles from that. But going back to your point around creating a framework we can't do a one size fits all. There is no cookie cutter approach to aligning workplace positive, engaged and happy cultures. What we've got to do is take elements of the most high performing organisation, what research has told us, and then the most important thing is we bring our own teams along the journey. It's not just about the science, it's not just about what other organisations are doing, it's what our team can also build as well.
So again, some of those key points that came up: individual uniqueness, respect. Now, I really liked Erin's identification of the varying cultures right around the world and the cultures that were actually present at our discussion. And in this discussion, culture is 100%. Culture is king. It's 100%. Now, the perspective of the lens is very important, and one for leaders to really embrace. So maybe the culture of a company in the US will be different to a culture of a company in Australia. It's certainly different to the culture of an organisation in Finland, let alone Asia and India. But in a global workplace, in a global workforce, where people can fundamentally work with anyone right around the world from a remote basis, it's where people feel valued that they'll ultimately do and provide their best work. That's something really, really important. So if you're in a remote working space where you do have global teams, you are in a global competition for culture. But the same also applies from a local perspective, because if you are bound geographically within a geographic sense, the culture of your workplace will be measured against the best culture locally. The question a leader should be asking if they are in that boat is, how do they compete with the preferred culture within your local community? Now, I really liked when Erin mentioned the sense of humour, because I really believe that that is so vital in any organisation. Organisations must truly every now and again be able to laugh at themselves, as do leaders. Leaders need to be a bit self-depreciating at times and to be able to laugh at themselves. But I really like Belinda's dissection of the chief happiness structure, the framework that quantum wellness have brought in, and the elements around that particular program, and how it encompasses the whole of organisation approach. Again, it's important to note, culture is not a cookie cutter. It's not a cookie cutter. It's unique, it's distinctive, but there are some common elements built around what I would call the common bond to the organisation. Once again, there's so much insight there that a leader should be taking away. So many organisations and many individuals, whether they're leadership or not, face obstacles, whether it's internal or external, around the concept of self-care. The panel took this on with gusto.
I think self-care is one of those things, again, where it's never the same for anybody. I think people have had different experiences, and it's funny that you're asking this question, actually, because I was asked to write an article for Women's Health Week next week. Women's Health Week is next week in Australia. And being a person with chronic illness and having had cancer in the past, I have some very different views about self-care, particularly in leadership, when you're in a leadership role. And I, was a CEO when I was going through cancer treatment. But, I think people want to hear that self-care is important. There are things that you should do, not do. My life revolves around motivational quotes type stuff. The reality is that's probably not the case for a lot of people, and we're not hearing that story. And we're hearing a lot of that, it's like toxic positivity stuff coming through that really isn't helpful for people who are actually going through a very difficult time. So I think self-care, when it comes to leadership, is really, in a way, respecting that it looks a certain way because society tells us that self-care looks a certain way. But for many, self-care might be going out for a drink on a Friday night, and that's okay. And you need to do that. And I think it's about respecting what's important to people and what they need to best perform in their roles, and what they need to best be able to lead their teams. And I think that at the end of the day, whatever that looks like, so long as it's not super damaging, whatever that looks like, it's important that people respect what that is. I think there is this socially perpetuated view of what health, self-care, and leadership should look like, and the way that should be carried out in an organisation. So I tend to tread carefully with with conversations about self-care, because like mental health, it's something that's can be very sensitive for leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate what Cindy shares. I think with the work that we do and the things that we're passionate about, which, this is an area that I'm passionate about based on my own personal journey as well. And I think, it's really important for us as we become, I'll just speak for myself here. It's important for me as I become a more conscious communicator with the work that I do, that I am constantly hearing any feedback around any of the areas that I, consider myself to be an area of focus. And so, yeah, self-care is different for everyone. Self-care means different things. That is a trigger term for people. There's no question about it. I've had clients remove themselves, from my program because they like being sick. There's actually a familiarity with it. For some people, there are some people, I had a client once who her father was sick a lot when she was a child, and so her mother was always attending to her father. And so as she got older, she started to learn that getting sick herself, and it was more of a subconscious process, but getting sick herself would get her the attention. And so in my program, we do some like mind body movement and things like that, and it was helping her, and she wasn't interested in the concept of the power of self-healing. It wasn't something that interested her, because eventually it takes her away from, she feels like she'll become unlovable if she actually exercises her power to self-heal. So this is just one example. So I've learned a ton by playing in this space over the years. And, I burn out as a leader, and I burnt out as a leader back in 2012 because I was not taking care of myself. I emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically was not in a good space. I wasn't doing what I could be for my body. And so the path that I took was to find ways to address that, because I felt like I had access to more. So, as it relates to self-care, I absolutely agree with Cindy again that it's just such a different term, and it's even a trigger term for people. For those leaders who are interested in self-care, many are afraid to talk about it. And the higher up we go in organizations, the more leaders, and again, these are all generalizations, this is my experience, my observations, the higher up we go in organizations, leaders do not believe they have access to self-care. They believe that self-care is a luxury, and that's simply not the case. And I'll wrap it up with this. I'm actually on faculty at a local university here, Villanova, and next week I will be delivering a talk in a session for a women's leadership development certification program, and the topic is translating self-care mindfully in the workplace. And the whole time we are going to discuss what that looks like. What is your personal plan of action, and that is supportive to you, that allows you to step into your place of work and, state these preferences. So
it's a really interesting topic, this one, because obviously running a peak performance company, working with peak performers, athletes, non-athletes, leaders, aspiring leaders and entrepreneurs, I approach it very differently. I approach it from a model of personal well-being, and how do we optimize our performance? Because as leaders, we're here to serve. It's our duty to serve. Whether you agree regardless of whether you agree you were put on this earth for whatever reason, whatever your, whatever your why is. But we are here to serve. It's our duty as leaders. And therefore, I believe it's our duty to make sure that our personal well-being model is optimized to the highest level that we possibly can. Now, I've got to categorize this. Yes, people do get sick. And Cindy, I appreciate and acknowledge and just want to say, thank you for sharing your journey with, with your illness as well. And having lost my mom through breast cancer, it's a really important topic. So I appreciate that leaders will have bouts of illness and sickness. But we as leaders need to step back. This is our personal responsibility. Our health and well-being is just as important as our P&Ls. It's just as important as the metrics in which we measure every element of our organisations, regardless of where you operate in the world. One of our KPIs needs to be, well, we have one at Quantum Wellness, which is the new company we've merged, by the way, which is our new company. That's one of the measurements. It's time in nature. So it's actually a KPI around time in nature, around health. That's one of our fundamental pillars. So it's finance, it's customer happiness, it's team happiness, but it's health. It's health and well-being is actually one of our pillars. If someone said to me, which is the most important, Belinda, in your role as CEO? Every single one. The P&L is just as important as my well-being as well as the team well-beings. Why are we putting them up or down? Why are we not having a line across where we actually say these are of vital importance? How can you lead from a place and not in abundance and in a deficit model where you are not well, aside from people who genuinely have, disease and sickness, of course. I'm on about personal choice now.
So the common thread there was, I'm pretty certain you picked it up, self-care is personal. And self-care is different for everyone. Self-care is different for everyone. And it really took me by surprise that self-care, the word self-care, can be seen as a bit of a trigger for some people. But understanding the insight that was being delivered by our experts, I can certainly understand how that can be the case. The one thing that I really have to say is that the insight here was incredibly diverse but highly valuable. Now, the obstacles that you face will ultimately many times come from within. Now, many leaders will share some thoughts, as expressed by Erin, that availability of self-care is not available for them, right? And we see this time and time again. It was interesting. The higher you go up the ladder, the less self-care you believe you have access to. Now, in the worst of cases, some leaders will look down on leaders that express the need for self-care. They'll look down their nose. They'll consider it a weakness. Now, these are real obstacles that are faced around the concept of self-care. Self-care is built, once again, around self-awareness and comes down to what is needed for you. What is needed for you? Once again, it can't be a cookie-cutter approach. For some people, self-care, like Belinda, it is climbing mountains. For other people, it might be about just winding down on a Friday night with a close friend or their partner. Self-care comes down to what is needed for you. But fundamentally, everyone needs self-care. Everyone needs personal well-being. These are really strong messages that came through. And this should be important for organisations. Now, the health of an organisation is often expressed completely differently to how we would express our own health. The dollar return, the financial, the profit and loss, the half-yearly results, the quarterly updates, and what people generally perceive as the health of an organisation. But fundamentally, as Belinda talked about, the health of the people is just as important as the continuing profitability of an organisation. So which led me to one of our final questions. What does a CEO need to be thinking about to drive not just a great culture within the workplace, but a fantastic performance-based culture?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your time today. And Cindy and Belinda, it was it's been really amazing hearing both of you share pieces and parts of your perspective and story. So to answer, Coach Carl, to answer your question, trust, right? Creating safety and trust, creating a community of safety and trust, which is obviously vague. This is going to allow for innovation and growth and creativity to soar in the organization. If the employee does not feel like they can openly share ideas or preferences or opinions, it's because they don't feel like they're safe in that environment. So I would say creating that environment of safety, trust, a sense of community, paying attention as a leader, not only to the verbal communication, but also to what we call nonverbal and material. And nonverbal communication is also different for everybody. ASL, for example, is maybe to some considered nonverbal, but in ASL it's verbal. So that being said, just being conscious of how we're showing up as leaders, who we're responding to, who we're not responding to, who are we emailing back, who are we not emailing back, the simple things, the fundamentals, material communication. How are we setting up the organization? What is the setting? What does the workplace environment look like? We don't talk about this a lot, but one of my clients, her entire focus is making the workplace environment green. So, how much attention is being placed on being conscious about the planet in the workplace setting? And then finally, I would say the one very biggest thing, it's I always say it's either the Dalai Lama or Mahatma Gandhi. I for some reason I get flip-flopped on this one, but it is being the change we want to see. I truly, truly believe this. I had a woman once say to me, if you think you're here to change the world, you're going to suffer and you're not going to do what you came to do. But if you're here to change yourself and be the best possible version of you, you're going to watch as things change around you. So a leader with that mindset is going to see some good things.
I have to agree. I think safety and trust are hugely, hugely important, and pretty much the cornerstones to good culture, really. And I think if we're providing an environment where even if people are coming to work for another day and they're not in a good space, they feel supported and they feel safe and they can trust that either their leader or the teams around them are going to support them to get through another day. Because in some workplaces, it's just like that. So if you can get through another day with the support that you need, sometimes that's all you need. If you are vulnerable and you're honest with your team, you will have their trust and you'll have their support, and you will have their respect as well.
Go back to your values as a leader. Like, truly go back to your values of yourself, your values of your organization. Be brutal around finding your strengths and limitations, and be vulnerable. Both Erin, Cindy and Coach Curl, you've also talked about it as well, about that, that vulnerability around knowing where your strengths are. No person is truly an island. Like, once we start to go insular and believe as a leader that we need to do this and we need to carry this challenge, these opportunities, these burdens solo and alone, then that's when our health and well-being, for example, will suffer. So making yourself the least important person in the business, I know, is going to challenge a few people on that one. Please do reach out to me if you're challenged by that, because I would love a healthy debate on it. But making yourself as the leader the least important part of the business. Yes, you've got to be the figurehead for some things, but also as well remember that your self-care, your well-being, your happiness also depends upon other people stepping up. And, making health and well-being, what about prioritizing it? Like, what about putting that as one of the number one areas for development, along with your P&Ls, along with your retention rates? Why not prioritize your health? Because you cannot put on, the old saying, when there's the oxygen mask and supplying your own oxygen. It's the same when we're at altitude. When I'm going to climb Everest, I'll need to make sure that before I help anybody else, I have to make sure that my oxygen mask on is so that I can go into the death zone. Otherwise, I'm no use to anybody. And I would implore leaders to do that firstly, look after themselves before they try to look after anybody else.
So once again, we saw some really strong common bonds in the messages there, messages around trust, safety, vulnerability, all shared by our experts. And I know from experience, and we see this in research, that companies that have a real strong attachment to their core values, and those core values are lived within the behaviours of each and every person within that organisation, they will often have much greater success than organisations that don't have that same attachment to the core values. Now, from my own personal value perspective, I was really grateful and appreciative of the time that Erin, Cindy and Belinda provided to share their insights with you, our listening audience. They are truly being the change that they want to see in the world. I know that there are many gems of insight, and once again, as I always do, how can people connect with our experts?
Yeah, absolutely. So erinjewelconsulting.com, that's the best way to connect with me. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Just send me a note if you have any questions about what was shared today or would like to follow up. Please do let me know. Thank you.
Just go to thegoodhuman.com.au or find me on LinkedIn.
You can connect with me in so many different ways. We are hyper connected. LinkedIn or Facebook, you are more than welcome to connect on LinkedIn. It's Belinda Jayne Dolan. And then obviously you'll be able to connect through our various organisations, and you will always be welcome to connect with me. In fact, I implore everybody that's listening to Erin, Cindy, Coach Curl and myself, please reach out to us. We're a valuable resource, and I personally would love to hear from everybody listening to the podcast today. And thank you, Coach Curl, for inviting me, Erin and Cindy. I appreciate you.
So there you have it. That was our very first panel discussion. And here are some of my key takeaways that I took from Erin, Cindy and Belinda. Being healthy is all about your own personal wellness and self-awareness. It's personal, it's yours, it's mine, it's personal. So being healthy as a leader is all about your own personal wellness. And that is in very many ways all about the total leader as to who you are and where you are in many, many cases. Culture is the responsibility of everyone within the organisation. We can't be pointing fingers at the leader or your leader that culture isn't great if you're not playing an active role in driving a positive culture. It is the responsibility of everyone in the organisation, but it needs consistent leadership traits to be achieved. Clear communication, openness, honesty. Which brings me to my last key takeaway: trust, safety, and vulnerability. Now, without great leadership and without leaders leading the way or role modelling these three key areas, that's just won't happen. You can't go into an organisation and say, you've got to trust me. You cannot expect trust if you are not trustworthy. You cannot expect people to safely talk about their issues, their problems, their concerns if you don't have that trusted environment. You don't have that. People need to be safe in what it is they're going to talk about. And in many ways, as Cindy talked about, if you are vulnerable as a leader, your team will trust you. But that vulnerability has to come from a genuine and an authentic space. It can't come from a fake space. It can't from faked vulnerability, because people see through that. And once again, those three key areas, trust, safety, and vulnerability, require leadership traits for them to roar into life. So what were your key takeaways? So why don't you share them with wherever you're listening to this podcast, or if you're over at todaysleader.com, share your thoughts around your key takeaways from our very first panel discussion. Do healthy leaders build healthy cultures? And once again, eternally grateful. And Erin, Cindy, and Belinda, their contact details will once again be in the show notes. Now is the time for you to take control of your leadership growth in this disruptive world we navigate. Our aim is to help you become the best leaders you need to be today by providing you access to global leaders and experts. If you're looking to build better leadership skills, check out the Today's Leader website at todaysleader.com. Today's Leader is a collective building the best leaders tomorrow, today. We have the mindset, of course, to make a difference, but we have the ability to create an impact. Think and Grow Business hosts our Today's Leader Masterminds. Think and Grow Business, where we focus on personal, professional, and business growth. Book your free 30-minute discovery call right from the homepage at thinkandgrowbusiness.com.au. You are standing stronger, braver, and wiser. Don't forget the golden rule. You know what it is. Just don't be an arsehole. I shall see you all again next time. Bye for now.